What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is February 2nd, 2026, about 9:15 a.m., and we are continuing our 18th book in our Book to React series. This is episode 3 of Huey P. Newton's autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide, from the famous founder of the Black Panthers, who is from my hometown, Monroe, Louisiana, though he is known and associated with the Bay Area, California. That's why we're out here repping for the first female vice president of the United States. Even though she is a genocidal warmonger, we are still going to represent Black excellence for whatever it's worth, whatever that means. You get what I'm saying? For today's episode, we are continuing reading part 1, and we will finish all of part 1 of Revolutionary Suicide, which will be the remaining 3 chapters, 4, 5, and 6. In the previous episode, episode 2, we read chapters 1, 2, and 3, where Huey P. Newton talked about his brief memories of growing up in Louisiana before the family relocated to Oakland, California, how the school system, broke apart his self-worth as a Black man, as a Black youth, right? And his love of fighting and, throwing hands and shit like that. So that's what we covered in the first section. Hopefully you found it engaging and enjoying. I encourage you to check it out. Without further ado, let's go to chapter 4 right here. The glory of my boyhood years was my father. There was no hint of servility in my father's makeup. Just as in youth he had refused to remain a slave, so in all the years of his manhood he disdained to be an Uncle Tom. From him we learned, and never doubted it, that the Negro was in every way equal to the white man, and we fiercely resolved to prove it, said Paul Robeson in Here I Stand. Chapter 4 is titled Changing. Hope has always been a scarce commodity in the Black community. Claude Brown, who grew up in Harlem, has written of this in Man-Child in the Promised Land. I read that book. It's a pretty good book. When he returned to Harlem after an absence of 4 years, he had a hard time finding many of the friends he had grown up with. It seemed as though most of the cats that we'd come up with just hadn't made it, he says. Almost everybody was dead or in jail. Many young Black men in our generation can say the same thing. Drugs, oppression, and despair take their toll. Survival is not a simple matter or something to be taken for granted. When I look back on my early years, I see how lucky I was. Strong and positive influences in my life helped me escape the hopelessness that afflicts so many of my contemporaries. First, there was my father, who gave me a strong sense of pride and self-respect. Second, my brother, Melvin, awakened in me the desire to learn. And third, because of him, I began to read. What I discovered in books led me to think, to question, to explore, and finally to redirect my life. Numerous other factors influenced me. My mother and the rest of my family, my experiences on the street, my friends, and even religion in a peculiar way. But these three, and most of all my father, helped me to develop and change. All right, go into the comments section. We have they lying on me in the comments. So shout out to they lying on me in the comments section. And continuing here with Huey P. Newton's text, he says, when I say that my father was unusual, I mean that he had a dignity and pride seldom seen in Southern Black men. Although many other Black men in the South had a similar strength, they never let it show around whites. To do so was to take your life in your hands. My father never kept his strength from anybody. Traditionally, Southern Black women have always had to be careful about how they bring up their sons. Through generations, Black mothers have tried to curb the natural masculine aggressiveness in their young male children, lest this quality bring swift reprisal. Let's repeat that. Through generations, Black mothers have tried to curb the natural masculine aggressiveness in their young male children, lest this quality bring swift reprisal or even death from the white community. My father was never subjected to this pressure, or if he was, he chose to ignore it. He somehow managed to grow up with all his pride and dignity intact. As an adult, he never let a white man humiliate him or any member of his family. He kept his wife at home, even though whites in Monroe, Louisiana felt they should be working in their kitchens, and made that plain to him. He never yielded, always maintaining his stand as a strong protector, and he never hesitated to speak up to a white man. When we children were small, my father entertained us with stories of his encounters with whites. He has not been well for the past few years, but even now, as he tells these stories, the old strength surges through him again. None of us realized it then, but those old stories were more than simple entertainment. He was teaching us how to be men. Beautiful, beautiful. And I know back then it was hard to be a black man in that world. You know what I mean? By the way, Luke Walks with Jesus is up in the chat. He said, Jesus Christ loves you. Shout out to Luke Walks with Jesus. And Huey P. Newton walked with Jesus. He said in this text right here that he was inspired by religion to change his life and to get out of the streets, you know what I mean, and to start reading and educating himself. But he also gives a lot of praise to his father, who was a preacher, you know what I mean, and he didn't let the Bible or Christianity or the white man's version of Jesus make him kowtow to white people or be scared of white people and basically raccoon it up. He didn't do that. So very inspirational right there. Continuing here. Huey P. Newton says, one time in Louisiana, he, his father, got into an argument with a young white man for whom he was working. The disagreement had to do with some detail about the job, and the white man became angry when my father stood his ground. He told my father that when a colored man disputed his word, he whipped him. My father replied just as firmly that no man whipped him unless he was a better man, and he doubted that the white man qualified. This shocked the white man and confused him, so that he backed down by calling my father crazy. The story spread quickly around town. My father became known as a crazy man because he would not give in to the harassment of whites. Strangely, this crazy reputation meant that whites were less likely to bother him. That is often the way of the oppressor. He cannot understand the simple fact that people want to be free. So when a man resists oppression, they pass it off by calling him crazy or insane. My father was called crazy for his refusal to let a white man call him the N-word or play the Uncle Tom or allow whites to bother his family. I'm saying the N-word because YouTube censors me every time I say it with a hard R or with an A. Whatever. So crazy to the whites, but he was a hero to us. Huey P. Newton says about his father right here. He even stood up to white men when they were armed. One evening, as he rode home from work with some other black men, for some reason, they stopped their car in front of a white man's house and began to talk and laugh. They did not see the white woman on the front porch, but pretty soon a white man came out of the house with an axe and yelled at them for laughing at his sister. The driver panicked and drove off. When they reached the corner, my father made him stop. He climbed out and walked back alone. The white man was advancing down the road with the axe. My father asked him why he had come out with that axe and what he had in mind to do with it. The white man passed off the incident lightly by saying something about, you know how these Southern women can be, and how he had to make a show to satisfy his sister. My father realized that in the etiquette of Southern race relations, this was an apology. Okay, Huey P. Newton's dad was out here making the white man apologize. Okay, he accepted it, but not before he made it clear to the white man that he would not be threatened. Okay, all right. That's bravery at that time. You know what I mean? He never hesitated to make his view known to anyone who would listen. Once, when he felt cheated by a white man, he let all the town know what had happened. The man heard the stories and came to our house to see my father. The white man carried a gun in the glove compartment of his car. My father knew that, but he nevertheless went outside unarmed to talk. He maneuvered around to the right side of the car and sat on the running board with the white man in front of him so that he could not get to the gun. Then he told the white man what he thought of him and said, if you hit me a lick, the other folks will have to hunt me down because you'll be lying here in the road dead. The white man drove off and my father heard no more about it. Okay, his father was outside just doing the most. Just doing the most. Just insane, man. Crazy. All right. Another time, some whites invited him to go hunting. To this day, I do not know why they asked him. They all took their shotguns. Knowing my father was a preacher, they tried to goad him into a discussion about the Bible and the origin of man. Adam and Eve were surely white, they said. So where did black people come from? Their convenient interpretation was that blacks must have sprung from the union of Adam and a gorilla. My father countered by saying that Adam must have been a low-life white man to have had sex with a gorilla. At this, the situation grew fairly tense, but nothing came of it. Okay. I mean, that's funny. That's just funny, because at the time, the whites believed everybody in the Bible was white, which doesn't make any sense at all, right? So they're trying to downplay black people by saying that the first man who was white must have had sex with a gorilla to birth black people, right? But then what does that say about the white man? That he's into bestiality, right? That he likes to have sex with animals? I'm sure the FBI statistics on who is most likely to be arrested for having sex with children and animals would probably point to a certain demographic. And that's what Huey P. Newton is getting at right here. But I digress. Anyway, his protection, his father's protection, extended to every member of our family. At the age of 15, my oldest brother, Lee Edward, went to work with my father in a sugarcane mill. The first step in the sugarcane process was to feed stalks into a gasoline-powered grinder. The grinder never stopped, and it had to be kept full or it would burn out. This was Lee Edward's job. They had cut the engine down some in the hope that Lee Edward could run it, but he got tired his first day in the mill. And about 11 o'clock, after 4 hours on the job, he could not keep the machine full. It ran down and burnt out. When the owner saw this, he began yelling at Lee Edward, but before he could say much, my father was right there. This white man was over 6 feet tall and weighed 200 pounds, but my father got right in the middle of it. He shut off the motor and told the owner it took a grown-up to keep Cain in the mill. My father took Lee Edward off the job after that. He wanted us to be good workers just as he was, but he also wanted us to grow up proud. I heard these stories and others like them over and over again until in a way his experiences became my own. Anyone who tried to bother us, black or white, had to contend with my father. It made no difference that the South did not tolerate such behavior from blacks. My father stood up to the white South until the day he left for California. He has never returned. The fact that my father survived these encounters may go deeper than a simple white defense mechanism. His blood was, after all, half white. And that same blood flowed in the veins of other local people, in his father, his cousins, aunts, and uncles. While local whites were willing enough to shed the blood of black people, it may be that they were afraid of being haunted by the murder of another white. Very interesting. Statistics bear this out. The history of lynching in the South shows that blacks of mixed blood had a much higher chance of surviving racial oppression than their all-black brothers. Very interesting. Huey P. Newton with a very colorist analysis. A colorist in the sense that it takes into account that different shades of blackness are treated differently and viewed differently by the white power structure. Very important. In any case, my father's pride meant that the threat of death was always there, yet it did not destroy his desire to be a man, to be free. Now I understand that because he was a man, he was also free, and he was able to pass this freedom on to his children. No matter how much society tried to steal our self-esteem, we survived on what we got from him. It was the greatest possible gift. All else stems from that. Very interesting. I don't know if that's an analysis of gender and power and patriarchy, because he says, you know, his father's desire to be a man is sort of what set him free, right? And because he was a man, he was also free. So is Huey P. Newton saying and acknowledging that if he didn't grow up without his father, he would have had less, socioeconomic advantages, however meager they might be for a black family in that time, living under Jim Crow? Very interesting analysis right here. I don't know if it will get more blatant than that, if Huey's going to start talking about sexism and patriarchy more blatantly, but let's see. Anyway, going to the comments right here. Tom Leach says, that shirt, I know, we fully lived up over here on this side. I'm going to get the MAGA hat too this year. I'm going to rock a MAGA hat next time I come on stream after a few months. After a few months, next time I come on stream, in a few months, you're going to see a MAGA hat. I promise you. Anyway, Melvin is only 4 years older than I am. Sorry. Let's continue here. I skipped a paragraph. So, this strong sense of self-worth created a closeness among us and a sense of responsibility for each other. Since I was the youngest in my family, all the other children had a deep influence on me, but particularly my three brothers. Of the three, it was Melvin who opened up most decisively the possibilities for intellectual growth and a special kind of self-realization. Melvin is only 4 years older than I am, and during childhood, we were constant playmates. Melvin planned to become a doctor, and I dreamed of being a dentist so that we could open an office together in the community. Somewhere along the way, these desires were lost, probably in school, where my scholarly ambitions died early. Although Melvin did not go to medical school, he was always a good student. Now he teaches sociology at Merritt College in Oakland. I always admired Melvin's intellectual activities. It was he who helped me to overcome my reading difficulties. When he began college, I used to follow him around and listen to him discuss books and courses with his friends. I think this later influenced me to go to college, even though I had not learned anything in high school. Melvin also taught me poetry by playing recordings of poems or reading to me. He was studying literature in school, and I suppose teaching me poems was a way of learning them myself. And I suppose teaching me poems was a way of learning them himself. We often discussed their meanings. Sometimes Melvin explained the poems to me, but after a while I found that I could understand them alone, and I began to explain them to him. All right, let's go here to Johnny B12. He's up in the chat. Shout out to Johnny B12 for joining the conversation. And continuing here with Huey P. Newton's book, very interesting how, he was so dedicated to his education. It sounds like, even when the school system was trying to break him down and tell him that black life is not worth it, there's nothing good that can come from a black mind, he was always still drawn to education. You know what I mean? And that's a beautiful thing. Gonna continue here. Shout out to Johnny B12 in the chat once again for supporting the content. I appreciate Johnny B12 up in here. Let's continue here with Huey P. Newton's book. He says, I seem to remember poetry without effort. And by the time I entered high school, my memory held a lot of poetry I had heard read aloud. As Melvin studied for his literature class at Oakland City College, I learned Edgar Allan Poe's The Bells and the Raven, The Long Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and by T.S. Eliot, Shelley's Ozymandias, and Adonais. I also liked Shakespeare, particularly Macbeth's despairing speech that begins tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, creeps in this petty pace from day to day. Shakespeare was speaking to the human condition. He was also speaking to me, for my life sometimes crept aimlessly from day to day. I was often like the player fretting and strutting my brief hour upon the stage. Soon, like a brief candle, my life would go out. I was learning a lesson, however, that contradicted Macbeth's despair. While life will always be filled with sound and fury, it can be more than a tale signifying nothing. That's a little bit of nihilism. And I know at the beginning of this text, Huey P. Newton's wife was saying he felt like he had outlived his life. And it seems like from his, interpretation of Shakespeare's Macbeth, like Huey P. Newton sort of looked at life as this, march towards death that's, unstoppable, of course, and that's sort of fatalistic and sort of gives life a small meaning. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, I'm going to continue here. Adonais, too, had a special impact on me. The poem tells the story of a man whose friend dies or is killed. One of the best things in the poem is the sense that with the passing of years, the poet's feelings alter and he begins to see things differently. He tells how he feels, how his attitude toward his friend changes as time goes on. This was an experience I began to have near the end of high school as my friends drifted into the service, or got married, or tried to become part of the very system that had humiliated us all the way through school. As time passed, I began to see the futility of the lives toward which they were headed. Marriage, family, and debt, in a sense, another kind of slavery. Osmandius impressed me because I felt there were different levels of meaning in it. It is a rich and complex poem. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Osmandius, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." So basically the story of a king's inscriptions on a piece of stone, right? That say, look at this great temple I built, look at this beautiful building, and there's nothing left, right, of it years later. You know what I mean? That's the same feeling I had when I first read the Quran. And in the Quran, they talk about empires that have come and gone, people that have walked this earth who thought they were incredible or powerful, and now look at them. There's nothing left of them, nothing to remain of them. You know what I mean? So anyway, the poem could mean that a man's life is like the myth of Sisyphus. Each time you push the rock up the mountain, it rolls back down on you. Men build mighty works, and yet they are all destroyed. This king foolishly thought that his works would last forever, but not even works of stone survive. The king's great monument was destroyed, victim of the inevitable changes that come with time. On the other hand, it could be that the king was so wise that he wanted people to take their minds off their achievements and look with despair, because they too would reach that edge of time where everything around will be leveled. Very interesting. That's an interesting interpretation. Those are good interpretations, okay? Huey P. Newton was a thinker, straight thinker. Anyway, often it is impossible to understand at any specific period in your life just what is happening to you. Since changes take place in imperceptible ways, this was true of my own adolescence. My admiration for Melvin led to a love of poetry and later to my interest in literature and philosophy. When my brother and I analyzed and interpreted poetry, we were dealing in concepts. Even though I could not read, I was becoming familiar with conceptual abstractions and the analysis of ideas and beginning to develop the questioning attitude that later allowed me to analyze my experiences. That led in turn to the desire to read, and the books I read eventually changed my life profoundly. Beautiful, beautiful. By the way, shout out to Reticent I up in the chat. Shout out to you. We're gonna thank you for joining the conversation. We're now on chapter 5 of Huey P. Newton's book, Revolutionary Suicide, right here. Chapter 5 starts like this. It's about a kid you were... Sorry. Let me turn this back on. Okay. All right, hold on. All right, chapter 5. It's about a kid like you were who believed. He was born believing, but as he grew, everything around him, beginning with his parents and sisters and teachers, everybody seemed to say that what he believed wasn't so. Sure, they said they believed, and they prayed and cried to God and Jesus Christ Almighty. But that was a few moments out of a couple hours in church each week. So somehow he became two personalities, one as sincere as the other, and then three, because he could stand off and watch the other two. The reason was that he suspected maybe the people who didn't believe might be right, and there was nothing to believe in. But if he accepted this and put down the beautiful, honest, good things, he'd lose out on all he could have gained if he'd never lost his belief in believing. This was said by Charles Mingus, Beneath the Underdog. All right, continuing. So, chapter 5 is titled Choosing. During my adolescence, often without realizing it, I was making important choices. Some influences in our early years are so clear that their effect cannot be denied. We also may unconsciously reject other influences as we go along. It is hard to say at any point how things will turn out. All the time I was going to junior high school and getting into trouble, fighting on the block, listening to poetry, and talking with Melvin. Other strong forces were at work. Often they were contradictory in nature and pulled me in different directions. This caused confusion and conflict later until I learned to sort them out and understand what they meant. One of the most long-lasting influences on my life was religion. Both my parents are deeply religious, and when Melvin and I were small, my father often read to us from the Bible. My favorite was the Samson story, followed closely by David and Goliath. I must have heard those stories 1,000 times. Samson's strength was impressive, as well as his wisdom and his ability to solve the riddles put to him. Strength and wisdom. I still link the hero with my father in those terms. I liked David and Goliath because, despite Goliath's strength and power, David was able to use strategy and eventually gain the victory. Even then, the story of David seemed directed to me and to my people. When we were growing up, we went to church every day, or so it seemed. Back then, the Antioch Baptist Church was only a little storefront where the faithful gathered. I belonged to the Baptist Young People's Union, the young deacons, the junior choir, and I attended Sunday school and worship services weekly. Damn. My father was the associate pastor for a long time. He liked to preach the sermon about the prodigal son, and as he preached, he really moved around in the pulpit, waving his arms and beating the stand. He terrified me with tales of fire and brimstone and how sinners and the unrepentant would end up in a lake of fire. He was a real burner. The whole family was involved in church one way or another, holding offices, singing in the choir, serving on the usher board, or other committees. I was very active as a junior deacon, and every third Sunday, the regular deacons gave us their chairs below the pulpit. We sat in their places and administered certain parts of the services, taking up the collection and leading the congregation in prayer, everything except delivering the sermon. I did it all. I even read the sick list and special messages, although I had difficulty with reading. None of the other junior deacons did any better. However, we were all pretty illiterate. If we were weak in reading, however, other activities compensated. I loved to act in plays because I had acquired a certain eloquence reciting the poetry that Melvin taught me. It was easy for me to remember a part after I heard it once or twice. My activities in church led to music. My parents were so impressed with everything I was doing that they decided to have me study the piano, mainly as a good way for me to take a more active role in the religious services. I studied piano for 7 years with some excellent music theorists and classical pianists. Okay, I didn't know Huey P was on the keys. Okay, imagine if Huey P grew up in the 90s. He would have been making beats. You know what I mean? He would have been on the MPC. Anyway, looking back, I see that my friends and I are all in the same boat, heading for hell on earth and trying to reach heaven in church. Nevertheless, taking part in church activities and leading the services gave us a feeling of importance unequaled anywhere else in our lives. For years, our pastor, Reverend Thomas, had a sign on the pulpit, "Prayer changes things." The congregation was encouraged to see prayer as the only way to salvation. If we had problems, sickness, accidents, financial difficulties, prayer was the answer. Everybody in the church prayed with you, sharing a common purpose that relieved tension and had a cathartic effect. No other institution in the community provided such an outlet. At the time, the church was the only stable force in the Black community, and while some people do not think it was very effective, it did offer a kind of permanence and stability to our lives. The church was always there, providing solace and hope. So for anybody out there who's saying, oh, you need to find God or talk to Jesus Christ, Huey P. Newton found Jesus Christ. He was deep off in that church. Huey P. Newton was a damn near evangelical Christian. Huey P. Newton loved him some Jesus, though I doubt he ever prayed to the white Jesus. So for me, the church, said Huey P. Newton, was a source of inspiration that offered a countermeasure against the fear and humiliation I experienced in school. Even though I do not want to spend my life there, I enjoyed a good sermon and shouting session. I even experienced sensations of holiness, of security, and of deliverance. They were strange feelings, hard to describe, but involving a tremendous emotional release. Though I never shouted, and emotion of others was contagious. Though I never shouted, the emotion of others was contagious. One person stimulated another, and together we shared in ecstasy and believed our problems would be solved, although we never knew how. James Baldwin has described this religious experience very well in The Fire Next Time. He writes about the excitement and ecstasy that can fill a church during the service. There is no music, he says, like that music. No drama like that drama of the saints rejoicing, the sinners moaning, the tambourines racing, and all those voices coming together, crying holy unto the Lord. Their pain and their joy were mine, and mine were theirs. They surrendered their pain and joy to me. I surrendered mine to them. Once you experience this feeling, it never leaves you. For a while, I thought of becoming a minister, but I gave it up when I studied philosophy in college. I began asking questions about the concept of religion and the existence of God, and trying to find God and understand Him as a philosophical, existential being. I began to question not only the Christian definition of God, but also the very foundation of my religion. I saw that it was based on belief alone, the soundness of which was never questioned. Because I eventually found it necessary to question and examine every idea and every belief that touched my life, I reached a kind of impasse with religion, yet its impact on me continues in different ways. To this day, for example, I rarely use profanity. Can you think about that? Huey P. Newton, big gangster, Huey P. Newton, you know what I'm saying? Barely used curse words, barely used profanity. And he said it's because of religion. I didn't know that. People who have come to know me often ask why. I can only say that profanity was never used in our home. If I had been caught using it, my father would have punished me. My mother and father always lived as Christians, and this extended to the way they spoke. When I think back on the meetings in that storefront, it seems to me that religion made an impression in a more important yet less direct way. It has nothing to do with a personal system of belief, but rather an awareness of what religious action can or ought to be. Something remarkable was taking place during every prayer service. When people in the congregation prayed for each other, a feeling of community took over. They were involved in each other's problems and trying to help solve them. Even though it was entirely directed to God and did not go beyond the meeting, it suggested how powerful and moving it could be to have a shared sense of purpose. People really related to each other. Here was a microcosm of what ought to have been going on outside in the community. I had the first glimmer of what it means to have a unified goal that involves the whole community and calls forth the strengths of the people to make things better. I am sure that is part of why I was drawn to religion and why it offered so much to me then. At the same time, I was growing aware of a wholly different style of life that had nothing to do with religion. One of the reasons so many people found comfort and solace in church was that it provided, even though briefly, an escape from the burdens and troubles of everyday life. There was another way of life, however, that did not seem to find this relief necessary. From what I could see, this other life from what I see, this other life also had none of the worries and problems that beset ordinary working class people. In our community, some people had achieved a special kind of status. They drove big cars, wore beautiful clothes, and owned many of the most desirable things life has to offer. Almost without trying, they seemed to have gotten the things for which the rest of the people were working so hard. Moreover, they were having fun in the process. They were not forced to compromise by imitating white boys and going on in school. They succeeded in spite of the humiliations of the school system. As a matter of fact, they often won success at the expense of the very people who caused our troubles. They opposed all authority and made no peace with the establishment. In doing so, they became big men in the lower class community. All right. It's Just Carl says, what is anti-blackness? Honest question. Anti-blackness, I would argue, is an explicit or implicit worldview, philosophy, set of actions, governmental policies, interpersonal actions amongst people that reinforce white supremacy and denigrate black life, thought, and expression. That's just off the top of my head. That's how I would define anti-blackness. But that's a very good question. What is anti-whiteness? Anti-whiteness is opposing white supremacy, because whiteness is not an inherent identity that is based upon, shared culture or goals. Whiteness is an exclusionary identity that was explicitly made to flatten European cultures and ideas and identities. I support European cultures. I want people to flourish in their cultures. I want the Germans, I want the Irish, I want the French to cherish their cultures, not in a nationalistic or jingoistic sense, but in a way to actually bolster those things and make them more inclusive. You know what I mean? But whiteness is an exclusionary category that was only created to denigrate and oppress other groups of people. And if it's not, somebody tell me, what is white culture? What is white language? What is any of that? There's no such thing. It was a creation of the American Western colonial slavery project. You get what I'm saying? And the results of those early projects. That's how I would define anti-whiteness. So anti-whiteness is a good thing because it opposes oppression and exclusions of groups of people, particularly among what we would define as European people. We support anti-whiteness because we want Europeans to flourish. We want the Hungarians to have their culture and build upon their culture and cherish their culture. We want the Italians, whatever that may be, the Spanish, etc. All right? So we support anti-whiteness because whiteness is flattening. Whiteness is oppressing. But we are adamantly against anti-blackness because blackness is the output of the social construct that created this unfair, unjust world for all of us, whether that be a person who identifies as white or a person who identifies as black. So very good question. It's just Carl. Very good question. Shout out to you for coming in here and supporting the live stream. Let's continue here with Huey P. Newton's text. So this was the world of Walter Jr., my second oldest brother, who was always called Sonny Man in our family. When I was small, he often took care of me, and I looked up to him. By the time I was a teenager, Sonny Man was a hustler with a reputation as a ladies' man. To this day, he has never married. To be a hustler means to be a survivor. The brothers on the block respected him and called him a hipster. Even in those days, when people asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I said I wanted to be like him. To me, Sonny Man was much freer than the rest of us. Compared with my father's struggle, the way Sonny Man lived offered much to my hungry eyes. My father's constant preoccupation with bills is the most profound and persistent memory of my childhood. We were always in debt, always trying to catch up from an early age. The bills meant I could not have any of the extra things I wanted. I hated the words so much it made me cringe inside. Just the way I felt listening to Little Black Sambo and the Tar Baby stories. For me, no words on the street were as profane as the bills. It killed me a little each time they were mentioned, because I could see the never-ending struggle and agony my father went through trying to cope with them. It is a situation familiar to most people in the Black community. In one of his letters to his father, George Jackson spoke for me. How do you think I felt when I saw you come home each day a little more depressed than the day before? How do you think I felt when I looked in your face and saw the clouds forming? When I saw you look around and see your best friends go for nothing. I know exactly what he meant. Once again, the pain of poverty stings deep, man. And as somebody who's been poor, still is poor, still part of the working poor, that stings deep, man. And that probably leaves just as much psychological scars as actual anti-Black racism. You know what I mean? Yeah. Anyway, my father always paid his bills on time. He might complain about them, particularly about the interest, but he paid. As I grew older, I would sometimes examine the bills he received, and I saw that in most cases, the greater portion of the money was going to pay interest. If we bought something like a refrigerator, we wound up paying double the original cost. Sometimes the bills exceeded his whole paycheck. My father never mailed his payments. Melvin and I took them to the stores because he wanted the receipts stamped. He felt that if he mailed the payments, they might make a mistake, not send the receipt, and charge him more. This had happened in the past. Every 2 weeks or once a month, depending on when the payment was due, he would make out a list for us and arrange the money in separate envelopes, one for each store, with the receipts inside. Then, when we returned, he would carefully check the receipts. For years, Melvin and I made the rounds of Oakland stores, paying bills for our father. I was still doing this when I was arrested in 1967. When I became aware of the effect of the bills on my family, I wanted to be free of them. It was more than the bills that disturbed me, however. We were in an impoverished state, and I found it hard to understand how my father could work so hard yet have so little. He was a jack of all trades, carpenter, brick mason, plumber. No job was beyond him. He worked at 2 and sometimes 3 jobs at once, and yet we never got ahead. After finishing one of his various jobs, he would hurry home and work around the house or in the garden and then go off to another job. We could not understand how he did it. Never a day of rest to relax, and never a complaint. I think the years of hard work are partially responsible for his poor health now. He was always a strong person and never sick until his later years. Horrible. Horrible. Absolutely horrible. Worked himself to death. Very similar to my grandfather's story. You know what I mean? My mom's dad, worked himself to death. You know what I mean? Very sad. Anyway, when I was older and had a chance to see how people in better circumstances lived, I saw that our difficulty resulted from the large number of people in our family. For years, all 9 of us lived in 3 or 4 rooms with little opportunity for privacy. Until I was 11 or 12, I had to sleep with Melvin in the kitchen, and sometimes before that, in bed with my sisters. It never occurred to me that I could have a room of my own. Fortunately, there was a great deal of affection and humor among us all, but still it was hard. I see now that in those years, the idea took root in my mind that we were suffering such hardship through our own fault. I equated the idea of the family with being trapped and plagued by bills. At an early age, I made up my mind never to have bills when I grew up. Okay. All right, that's funny. I could not know then that this determination would extend eventually to the point of not being married or having a family of my own. Aw. I mean, I think a lot of kids have that idea. When I was a kid, I thought, I'm never going to get married. I'm never going to have kids. And, I got married twice, but I still don't have kids. You know what I'm saying? And, partially afraid of it. But I realize probably it's an eventuality that we got to live with, Anyway, my fear of being hounded by debt led me down Sunny Man's Road for a while. When I saw how much he was respected on the block, I began to spend most of my time there. At first in the little gangs we had in school and at parties, but later in the pool hall and bars. For a long time, I was attracted to this way of life until I discovered it was not what it seemed. That came later. Even though I was attempting to be like Sunny Man, I nonetheless admired Melvin and his educational achievements. Both avenues seemed to offer a way, but I could not know which road was best. I had seen blacks take the education road and get nowhere. Many of them returned to the block, scorning their years in school and cursing the white man for holding them back. Other blacks had apparently made it on the block, but ended up broken men, in prison or dead. There was no clear pattern to follow. It was hard to know what to do. This dilemma faces almost all young black men struggling to achieve a sense of identity in a society that denies them their basic rights. The black teenager, in his most impressionable and vulnerable years, looks around and sees a contradiction between society's expressed values and reality, the way things actually are. The sunny men of the community who defy authority and break the law seem to enjoy the good life and have everything in the way of material possessions. On the other hand, people who work hard and struggle and suffer much are the victims of greed and indifference, losers. This insane reversal of values presses heavily on the black community. The causes originate from outside and are imposed by a system that ruthlessly seeks its own rewards, no matter what the cost in wrecked human lives. This can be profoundly disorienting to a teenager trying to understand and define himself. Like adolescents everywhere, he wants an image to model himself after. And he becomes confused because there is such a disparity between what he is taught and what he sees. Most adolescents in black communities expect no justice from school authorities or the police. The painful reality of their lives from childhood on reveals that the inequalities they encounter are not confined to a few institutions. The effects of injustice and discrimination can be seen in the lives of nearly everyone around them. A brutal system permeates every aspect of life. It is in the air they breathe. In attempting to cope, the teenager seeks some kind of protection for himself in order to survive, some way of dealing with the contradictions that surround him. This usually takes the form of resistance to all authority. For many adolescents, it is the only weapon they have. Most of the time, their rebellion is directed against authority outside the home. But if there is no strong family support, it can disrupt their relationships at home. Even the closest families crumble because outside pressures are so relentless. To a certain extent, this was true for me when I was in junior high school. My rebellion was minor and never became a serious problem, though it caused friction for a while. Looking back, I see that it was a reflection of the confusion and sense of fragmentation I was going through, part of the process of finding out who I was. It was also the beginning of my independence. Everyone in our home shared the household chores. Mine were the usual ones, taking out the garbage, and after my sisters left home, washing the dishes and cleaning the stove. I also had to trim the hinges around the house. My father supervised the outside, while my mother's domain was inside the house. I hated chores and always tried to escape them, pedaling away on my bike and leaving everything to Melvin. I often stayed away from home until late at night, even though I knew my parents would punish me when I returned. Sometimes I made up fancy stories to tell them, but nothing could save me from punishment. I preferred my mother's whippings. She was more gentle, but most of the time my father did it. Another responsibility I failed to carry out was a paper route I had for a time. I spent all the money I collected and could not pay the bill. When the people who had paid money did not receive their papers, I had to give it up. This kind of resistance was due in large part to the need to assert myself as a separate person, apart from my parents. I was beginning to want to make my own decisions. Often this independence took the form of avoiding responsibilities. At other times, it was more constructive. Ever since I can remember, I have hated to see anyone do without the things he needs. This attitude probably came from my father's influence and the ideas he expressed in church. Once, when I was about 15, I met a kid who had no food at home. This was one of those nights when I was staying out late, and I brought him home and woke up my parents rummaging through the kitchen cabinets. When I told them the boy and his family needed food and that we could share ours, they did not object, although they were angry about my staying out late. Another time, when Melvin was going out to San Jose State College, he needed a car but had no money. I had a small savings account, about $300, and I gave him all of it. My parents teased me about giving away all my money, but at bottom, they were proud of the example of family closeness. I mean, $300 back then was possibly like $3K now. So Huey P was stacking up that money on that newspaper route, wasn't he? Anyway. Other times, though, I showed my sense of closeness in ways they did not approve of. Whenever my sister, Myrtle, got stranded at a party or somewhere else, she always called and asked me to pick her up. I would wait until my parents were asleep and then swipe the car keys. I did this every time she asked me, and every time I got into trouble for taking the car because I was not old enough to drive. My parents never spared the rod when I was young. As I grew older, they punished me in other ways, but I knew they did it because they cared about me and wanted me to develop a sense of responsibility. I think, too, they admired my independence, even though it sometimes worried them. They must have known I was at a difficult stage of development. Most Black parents are very aware of the conflicting and bewildering influences that surround their children, and they experience a deep anxiety over whether they will get into trouble with the law or at school. They understand only too well how the system works. The loving discipline exerted in our home was not lost on me. And when the time came, it stood me in good stead. Beautiful chapter. I really like chapter 5 as he talks about religion. He talks about growing up, seeing the dope man on the streets, and how the black community exists, with the institution of the black church that sort of creates community, union, and is able to bring people together, and also give social psychological release. At the same time, you notice that all the poor people in the community have really good hearts, really God fearing people, and all the bad people in the community seem to get rewarded with financial gain. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's very psychologically confusing. Okay. All right. It's just Carl is up in the chat. He says, "We are both men, not black or white." And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And the creation of race as a system to oppress people begins first with whiteness, because whiteness was the creation that the powers that be put in place to dictate who is able to gain the spoils and rewards of an unjust society that was founded on race. And so, with that, we want to abolish race, and that's why we are anti-white. That does not mean being anti-white people. We just acknowledge that whiteness is a social construct that was meant to confuse people of European ancestry of various sources, to just flatten all sorts of culture and just meld into some monoculture that strips them of their humanity of caring for other people who are not white. So yeah, we're going to be reading one more chapter, chapter 6 right here. And that will be the end of part 1 of Revolutionary Suicide by Huey P. Newton. Hopefully you're enjoying this. Chapter 6 should be short. It's titled High School. And let's start here. "We love our country, dearly love her, but she does not love us. She despises us," said Martin Delany in 1852. I forgot who Martin Delany was. I think he was an abolitionist. I'm not sure if he was black or white. When he says despises us, though, it makes me think he was a black man. But in general, abolitionists were not very popular as well. But I'm going to continue here. So, high school. Throughout high school, I constantly did battle with the instructors. The clashes I had steadily intensified and finally led to my transfer out of the Oakland system for a while. In the 10th grade, I was attending Oakland Technical High School on Broadway and 41st. One day, the teacher sent me to the principal's office for a minor offense I had committed the day before. The principal and teacher agreed that I could come back if I said nothing in class for the rest of the semester. I had already decided that I wanted out of school entirely, but I tried to sit mutely in class and not violate any of the rules, such as chewing gum or eating sunflower seeds. One day, I forgot the agreement and raised my hand to ask a question. The teacher blew up. "Put your hand down," he said. "I don't want to hear any more from you this whole term." I stood up and told him it was impossible to learn anything if I was forbidden to ask questions. Then I walked out of the class. Okay, damn. High school was kicking Huey's ass. Leaving school then meant I was short of classes and would be unable to go on to the 11th grade and graduate. So I went to live in Berkeley with my oldest sister, Myrtle, and transferred to Berkeley High School. Although Oakland was known in the East Bay area as a rough community, it was not until I transferred to Berkeley High School that real trouble started with the police. One Sunday, while walking over to a girl's house, I met 4 or 5 girls I knew. They asked me to go with them to a party. Although I did not take up their offer, we walked along together, since we were going the same way. Pretty soon, a car pulled up carrying a guy named Mervyn Carter. He's dead now, and some others. They jumped out and began hassling me about messing around with their girlfriends. I recognized Merv Carter. In fact, I had hung around Berkeley High with him and a couple of his friends. Like everybody else, they were turf conscious and hated to see an outsider making time with their girls. I reminded him that we knew each other, that I was not interfering with the girls and was on my way somewhere else. Anyway, I said, we hang around together in school. He told me we were friends inside school, but not outside. I could not understand why he said that, whether he meant it or was just trying to impress his buddies. By the time they had dropped a half circle on me, I realized they were going to jump me. So I hit Merv in the mouth, and then they all came at me. They beat me up pretty badly, but I refused to fall down. The girls were yelling at me to run, but I would not. No matter how many guys Merv had with him, I meant to stand my ground. As long as I could, I was going to look them in the eye and keep going forward. Okay, Huey was really about that action. He was really about that action. My God. My God. Somebody called the police. Somebody called the police. But by the time they arrived, Carter and the others had gone, and I was there alone, bleeding and missing several teeth. Although the police tried to find out who did it, I would not tell them anything. I did not want to be an informer because this was a problem between the brothers. The outside racist authorities had nothing to do with it. I have always believed that to inform on someone to the teacher, to the principal, or to the police is wrong. These people represent another world, another racial group. To be white is to have power and authority, and for a black to say anything to them is a betrayal. So I did not inform, and they escaped the police, but they could not escape me. Okay, Huey P was not about that snitching life at all. At all. Shout out to Shamit Gray up in the chat. Okay. Shout out to Shamit Gray for showing support in the chat. We're going to continue here. Okay. The next day, I went to school carrying a carpenter's hammer and an old pistol I had swiped from my father. The pistol did not work. It lacked a firing pin, but I had no intention of shooting anybody anyway. At lunchtime, I cold trailed Merv and about 6 of his buddies downtown. Catching up with them finally, I started to swing on him with the hammer. I hit him several times, wanting to hurt him, but he rolled with most of the blows and was not hurt too badly. Meanwhile, I forgot I had the gun. When the others began picking up rocks and sticks, I remembered the gun and used it to keep them at bay. This was the only way I could defend myself, because I had no friends at Berkeley High School to help me. I could not let them get away with what they had done, particularly since they had falsely accused me of messing with their girlfriends. Somebody called the police again, and when I heard the sirens, I ran farther downtown, where I was arrested. I was only about 14 then, so they took me to juvenile hall, where I stayed for a month while they investigated my family background. Then I was released to the custody of my parents. Huey P was out there. Huey P was out there throwing them hands, pulling guns at 14, transferring from high school to high school. This goes to show you that you can change your life. You know what I mean? Where you start is not how you finish. Huey P literally was a thug outside. He was like NBA YoungBoy. You know what I mean? If Huey P were alive today, he'd be NBA YoungBoy, pulling out guns, pulling up on people. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's nasty work. Sean McGray is saying, I'm sorry, but you don't have to apologize for anything, man. The chat is open for everybody to discuss, to troll, whatever, because all engagement helps this content spread. And what I'm trying to do is share these great books, these great works by our elders, our ancestors, our leaders like Huey P. Newton, and I just wanted to get out to as many people as possible because I don't think many people know that Huey P. Newton wrote a memoir about his life. You know what I mean? I don't think Huey P. Newton's revolutionary suicide is as popular as it needs to be. And so this is my first time reading it, and I hope you're reading it too, and I hope you enjoy it and find it enlightening. Anyway, so this was my first time in anything that could be called criminal, even though I had raided fruit trees, cracked parking meters, and helped myself to stuff in the neighborhood stores. I never looked upon that as stealing or doing anything illegal. However, to me, that was not taking things that did not belong to us, but getting something really ours, something owed us. That stealing was merely retribution. When I was released from juvenile hall, Berkeley High School refused to admit me again because my parents lived in Oakland. I went back to Oakland Tech. My friends there and others who knew me praised what I had done in Berkeley. What I had done was an accepted action under the circumstances. If I had not retaliated, I would have been less respected. Things went along well at Oakland Tech for a change. I was able to handle my differences with the teachers a little better because of my satisfaction with life outside the classroom. My reputation as a fighter kept the wolves away. I was also known as a hipster like my brother, Sunny Man. And I liked that too. Some of the kids even called me crazy, but that never bothered me because they used to call my father that. To me, crazy was a positive identity. When I got my first car, it did a lot to help my crazy reputation. My father gave me one that had lots of spots on it from primer paint. Melvin named it the Gray Roach. We would pile into it and go riding, looking for girls or some action. My friends did not like the way I drove, which led to any number of arguments and fights. Since there were so few cars available to joyride in, they had little choice. Sometimes I backed up fast as I could, drove a whole block, and when we reached the corner, I would jam on the brakes. The guys would fall out the car, yelling. Sometimes fights started right there. At railroad crossings, when the guardrail was down to signal an approaching train, I kept right on driving around the guardrail and over the tracks. I had several near misses, and as soon as we crossed the tracks, everyone would pile out of the car again, arguing and fighting. When the fights were over, our friends were stronger than ever. They respected me, even though they thought I was crazy. I thought I could outmaneuver anybody, anything, and never passed up a chance to try. Since I always won, I soon believed that I could always defeat the invincible and the powerful, the way David defeated Goliath. Eventually, in my pride, I believed I could outmaneuver death. Thank God my first car was a Nissan not a Nissan Maxima, a Nissan Xterra. You can't whip that thing around the city. I mean, I know some young folks, they get their first car, you know what I mean? And it's their mama Sentra, the Nissan Sentra, you know what I mean? The Ford Focus, and they whip it all through the city. Man, car crashes, wrecks, all types of stuff. All right. Shout out to Minitron96 up in the chat for supporting this content. Appreciate you, Minitron. Thanks for joining the conversation. And let's continue here. Huey P. Newton says in Revolutionary Suicide, I have never feared death. The escape from finitude was an idea that came to me after I saw the movie Black Orpheus. I loved that film and saw it many times, although I thought the outcome would have been different had it been my life. Whereas Orpheus flirted with death and died, I had been in lots of conflicts, near death on many occasions, but had always come out alive. Since I had not been killed, I guess I concluded that I could not be killed. Orpheus, too, attempts to outmaneuver death, even though the history of mankind proves that death always wins. In spite of this, the only way that Orpheus can maintain his dignity is to be unafraid and attempt to outmaneuver his oppressor. This seems characteristic of human existence, for although all of us are sentenced to death each day, we try desperately to get away from it. If we cannot, we try to put it off by acting in a manner that discredits death and eliminates our fear of it. This is our victory. Black Orpheus demonstrates an even more profound truth. It is possible to circumvent death through the heritage that one generation passes on to another. At the end of the film, the little girl is dancing while the little boy plays Orpheus's guitar. Though Orpheus and his woman are dead, her dance is a victory over death. The new generation survives and the sun still shines. The world does not stop because death has crushed a beautiful and significant part of it. Orpheus had passed on his guitar to the little boy. This means of sustaining life raises the sun again. I saw the movie Black Orpheus. It's okay. I mean, classic Brazilian film. Watch it. It's fun. I'm not going to hate on it. It's just okay. I also remember that Barack Obama said he really hated this movie, and his mama really loved this movie. So that's something else to consider when you watch Black Orpheus, the Brazilian film. I think it was from 1960 something. Anyway, I held on to the idea that I was immune to death for a long time. I still do not fear the end, but I no longer believe that I cannot be killed. Life has taught me that it is an ever-present possibility. Too many of my comrades have died in the past few years to let me feel that my last day will never come. Even so, I tell the comrades you can only die once, so do not die 1,000 times worrying about it. Around this time, some people got the notion that I had mystical powers. I began to put various friends and acquaintances into hypnotic trances, mostly at parties or in some of the rap sessions with brothers on the block. I learned the technique first from Melvin, who had been taught by Solomon Hill, a fellow student at Oakland City College. Later, I studied hypnosis techniques on my own and became pretty good at it. It is easy to learn, but dangerous. Just learning the technique does not teach you all you should know when you are dealing with a person's mind. You can easily hurt someone. I guess I have put over 200 people into trances at various times. I gave them post-hypnotic suggestions to eat grass, bark like a dog, or crawl over the floor like a baby. And sometimes I stuck pins and needles into their flesh. Once I used auto-hypnosis and put myself into a trance. When Melvin put a red-hot cigarette on my arm, I did not move or feel any pain, although he burned me pretty badly. This incident impressed a lot of people, but Melvin was pretty upset about it. Far from using hypnosis in a destructive way, I used it for styling in the community. As my reputation grew, the novelty wore off, and finally I stopped because it was no longer interesting. Okay, those paragraphs could have been clipped. Those paragraphs could have been clipped. Those are creepy, I would say. Makes him seem like a bit of a narcissist too, because only like narcissists and sociopaths are into like mind control. But I'll continue. When I was not putting people into trances or racing around in the gray roach and drinking wine with the brothers, I was standing in a crowd of people at parties reciting poetry. My problem was that I could not dance, and when the music began, I felt self-conscious. I did not leave when the dancing started. I would begin discussions or recite poetry. By the time I reached high school, I was really very good at remembering the poetry I had heard read aloud. Much of it was poetry that Melvin had taught me. David's favorite was the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Whenever I recited at parties or got people into deep conversations, everyone would stop dancing and gather around. Some of them would ask me to recite things I had memorized. The host or hostess usually became angry when people stopped dancing, and often I would be asked to sit down and shut up or split. This usually signaled the beginning of a fight. Somehow I managed to stay in Oakland Tech until I graduated, despite my continued defiance of the authorities. They tried to down me for many years, but I knew inside that I was a good person, and the only way I could hold on to any self-esteem was to resist and defy them. Everything they opposed, I supported. That was how I first became a supporter of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Earlier, when I heard teachers criticizing Paul Robeson, I defended him and believed in him, even though I knew very little about his life. When they started putting down Castro and the revolution of the Cuban people, I knew it must be good. I became an advocate of the Cuban Revolution. I would say this too. By the way, shout out to Ian Manghem. Shout out to Ian Manghem up in the chat. I had this same experience when I was in high school. I remember hearing about one of my history teacher. I grew up in Louisiana. My history teacher was an old racist white woman, of course, and she starts going on this big rant about how communism is evil, communism is the worst, and everything like that. And I remember raising my hand. I think I was in 9th or 10th grade, and I said, in communism, did they enslave black people? In communism, did they commit genocide against Native Americans? In communism, I started going on and on and on. And, there's arguments to be made that the Soviet Union, committed atrocities and war crimes and negative things against people. But at that age, I didn't even know about it. But I would also argue that an ideology cannot be blamed solely for the crimes that people commit. If that's the case, Christianity should be discredited. Christianity should be thrown out the window because people are committing heinous atrocities right now, under the guise of Christianity, under the banner of Christianity. But I digress. I remember doing the same thing when I was in high school, like Huey P. Newton, just being contrarian with the teachers just to do it, just to be it. Anyway, this is the last paragraph of chapter 6, and then we're going to call it a day right here. Huey P. Newton says in Revolutionary Suicide, "My high school diploma was a farce. When my friends and I graduated, we were ill-equipped to function in society, except at the bottom. even though the system said we were educated. Maybe they knew what they were doing, preparing us for the trash heap of society, where we would have to work long hours for low wages. They never realized how much they had actually educated me by teaching the necessity of resistance and the dignity of defiance. I was on my way to becoming a revolutionary, says Huey P. Newton. At the end of chapter 6, we finished part 1. We're going to start part 2 in our next reading tomorrow. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully this is a educational, enlightening, fun, and productive Black History Month in 2026. We will be reading more books by Black authors. If we so happen, inshallah, to finish Huey P. Newton's text before the end of February. We're going to try to do this every day. And I love the support and engagement from everybody who's joining the live streams. And remember, if you ever want to read the text along with me, you can just click on the second live stream that we're running simultaneously with the one that's vertical, and you can look at the text on screen that I'm looking at. You know what I mean? And interact with me over here as well. I have both chats open so I can talk to the people. But yeah, let me give a shout out to everybody who joined the live stream. Shout out to Ian Mangum. Shout out to Minitron96. Shout out to Shamika Gray. Shout out to It's Just Carl 1983. Shout out to I Reticent I. Shout out to Johnny B12. All right. Shout out to Tom Leach. Shout out to Luke Walks with Jesus. And shout out to They Lying on Me, who all joined the live stream conversation. I really appreciate that. I will catch y'all on the next live stream tomorrow. Y'all be easy out there. All power to the people and peace.